Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Easthampton Council on Aging and our End of Life Options Act Forum. My name is Ed Kaler, and I'll be moderating. This is an informational forum only, not a debate. Citizens of Massachusetts need to understand this important piece of legislation that is currently being considered by our representatives in the state capitol. I will briefly introduce our forum members and then call on them one at a time to present their professional and personal views on the importance of the End of Life Options Act. Each forum member will be given 15 minutes to present, and then we will have our question and answers afterwards. This forum is being video recorded so that those who could not be here this evening will have an opportunity to see it on our Council of Aging YouTube channel, as well as Easthampton Media and other TV stations in the state, as well as many websites. So we will begin with introductions. Our forum members this evening, to my left, is John Berkowitz, the Director of Western Massachusetts Death with Dignity. Next to him is Sara Bartley, who is citizen supporter of the Act. And next to Sara is Dr. Shelly Berkowitz, who is a family practice physician in Northampton. We will begin this evening with John Berkowitz.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Council on Aging. Thank you. And it's good to be back here. This is maybe a good segue, because one of the reasons I got involved with this issue a few years ago, just 2.5 years ago, is because for the last 8 years, I have been offering all over this valley what I call aging support groups. I am 72 now, so I started offering them when I was 64. That was a watershed year for me, turning 64. For those of you who are old Beatles fans, the Beatles had a song about when I'm 64. They never thought they'd get there, but now the two surviving Beatles are something like 75 and 76. You know, Paul McCartney and who else? Ringo Starr. So these aging support groups that I've been leading, I call Living Fully, Aging Gracefully, and Befriending Death. And they have been very rich conversations about everything about growing older. I also call it the joys and challenges of aging. And one of those groups 2 years ago was we were glad to be offered space here in the basement, a good group of people meeting every 2 weeks for 7 months. So we had a lot of time to talk and a lot of discussion. And that was only one of 3 groups. There are 3 different support groups in different parts of the valley over these last 8 years. And one of the common themes that always came up in all these groups is loss and grief, which of course comes with the territory of growing older. It's inevitable. Everyone has a story of loss, whether it's a spouse or a parent or a friend or a colleague, whatever it is. And so often I found many people had wonderful stories about the end of life and the dying process of their loved ones, and they went peacefully and they went without much pain. But all too often in these stories, in these groups, were people sharing very difficult end-of-life processes for those that they loved. And of course, they were there witnessing it, helping, caring, trying everything they could. And they were not doctors. They were not hospice staff. They were there also. You know, hospice is in something like 90 or 95% of end-of-life situations with people at home or in the hospital or assisted living, nursing facility, whatever. But they saw a very difficult end-of-life process, dying process. And those stories really affected me and kind of woke me up one day a couple years ago, and I heard about this bill and I heard about this campaign. And by the way, it wasn't new, and Massachusetts didn't invent it. This campaign started really 30 years ago, especially in the state of Oregon, which became the first state in the nation to pass a law called, you could call it the Death with Dignity Law, and that's the name of our organization on the little sign here, Western Massachusetts Death with Dignity. You could also call it the Medical Aid in Dying Law, or Compassionate Aid in Dying. So Oregon has had the law for 22 years, and it's been working well, it's been implemented well. There are no examples, no documented, no cases that went to court or the state got questioned. Some vulnerable older person, a terminally ill person, or some person of low income or minority member or a person with a disability. Nobody got pushed into choosing to end their life. And when I say that, just to really make it very clear and concrete, the laws offer medical aid in dying means that you, if you qualify as a terminally ill, 6 months or less to live, and you are mentally capable, you understand what you're asking for, you are your own healthcare proxy, you're making your own healthcare decisions, and that means you are not somebody with dementia or Alzheimer's. Those are awful diseases. But if you're terminally ill with that and let's say cancer or something else, you're no longer able, at the end stage of dementia or Alzheimer's, you're no longer able to make your own healthcare decisions. And so they are not covered or eligible under this kind of law because they're not really able to make any healthcare decision for themselves, what kind of treatment they want or don't want at the end of life, much less make the choice. So what this is really for and how it's been used is terminally ill people, mentally competent, capable people, their own healthcare proxy. And they say, my diagnosis, my kind of cancer, I face the prospect, you never know exactly, but the prospect of this kind of cancer, or quite often it leads to the possibility of a very painful and difficult ending, whether that's a few days, it could be weeks, could be months. And that's what this campaign is based on, what I was referring to. People in my groups, I think you're going to hear from my other supporters in the community here, the next speakers, just these personal stories of how it really didn't work well. And their loved ones really wished that they had an option. And what the option means is if you qualify, terminally ill, mentally capable, you have to go see 2 doctors 2 weeks apart. They have to verify that you are that sick, you're terminally ill. They have to verify that you are mentally capable. Then you can ask that doctor if he or she will prescribe a medication, and enough medication that if you chose to end your life before your illness became unbearable, and sometimes it's even a hard word for me to get out. I've never experienced unbearable pain, but a lot of people have witnessed it in the end of life of people they loved, and it's very difficult. And I don't want that for myself, and I don't want it for anybody. So that person would be able to go to a pharmacy, pick up the prescription, and if their pain and if their suffering became too difficult at the end of their lives, they could make the choice. I'd rather have a quality of life and be able to be conscious and aware, and then at a certain time of my choosing, if I felt like the pain and the suffering was going to get too difficult, I could end my life a few days, a few weeks before this illness was going to end it in a difficult way. And by the way, I just want to accentuate, and I believe Dr. Berkowitz, who will be the third speaker, I should just give a little asterisk right here. Dr. Shelly Berkowitz is not a relation to me. We just have a common last name. And when we discovered that, we had a good laugh, and we always do laugh, and people say, oh, gee, they must be related, but none whatsoever. Except that we do believe strongly in the same issue, and that's why we're here on the panel. So
our sons have the same first name.
And our sons have the same first name. Yes, it's a very small world. So I want to really accentuate another point, which is no doctor has to participate if they don't wish to, if it's against whatever principle, call it moral or philosophical or religious or whatever it is. They don't have to participate. For that matter, no pharmacist who has the medications has to agree to give a patient who asks for, if it's against their whatever, their wishes. This is a totally optional law. It's called the End of Life Options Act, and it's interesting. It's really meant to give patients another option than just facing the end of their disease. Hospice does great work and keeps people very comfortable. Pain management has come a long way, makes great strides. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work well in a certain number of cases, and it's too many. If it wasn't too many, it's a minority, I will say, but it's still too many. And if that wasn't the case, we wouldn't be the 10th state that if we pass this law, we'd become the 10th state, is what I'm saying. Oregon, Washington, Maine just passed it in the spring. New Jersey just passed it in the spring. Hawaii, Colorado, some of it is in the literature you've got. But there are just so many examples, so many stories like you'll hear more of tonight. And perhaps some people in the audience will share during question and answer, some of their stories as well. But that's what this movement, that's what this campaign is fueled by, people's personal stories and knowing they don't want that for their loved ones. And I'll just say, and I don't want that kind of ending for myself. So even for people who are healthy at 72 or whatever age, we also know that we're no different than anybody else. And we could have a terminal illness at the end of our life, and we want the option, the choice. But then, of course, it's also optional for those who are participating, doctors. There's nothing mandatory about this. So that's, maybe I'll just say also the law itself, with the time I've got left, the law has been proposed in Massachusetts for about the last 10 or 12 years. Every 2 years, the legislature runs in 2-year sessions. Every 2 years, the same state representative, not from around here, his name is Representative Louis Kafka from Stoughton, Massachusetts, down near Boston. He introduces this law. Why? Because in 2007, one of his best friends, who he names Al, I've read his story, I've heard him tell his story, his friend Al died of pancreatic cancer. It was very difficult, and his friend Lou could not help him. The doctors could not help him, couldn't give him the option because it's not legal in this state. It wasn't Oregon, it wasn't Washington State at that time, not here. And Lou Kafka said, I can't help you with this painful ending, but I'm going to help and fight so that nobody in our state has to go through what you went through at the end of your life. And that's what has propelled Lou Kafka, Representative Kafka, to fight for 10, 12 years. And he's still the lead sponsor of the bill. But I'm happy to say it has more co-sponsors this year than ever before, 46. And another big change, which you may hear from Dr. Berkowitz down the line a little bit, the Massachusetts Medical Society changed its position. They had always been opposed to this idea of assisted dying or medically assisted dying. But they surveyed their members. They found a lot of people changing on this, physicians changing on this issue. And in December of 2017, not that long ago, they changed from outright opposition to what they call engaged neutrality. Doesn't mean they're supported, but they're no longer opposed. And whenever a medical society in other states, those 9 other states that have passed it, plus Washington, D.C., I didn't mention them, the medical society changed to neutral and the legislature passed the law because they realized, no, the medical community in our state is going to work with us. If the will of the people and the will of their leaders is to allow this law and allow this option, then those doctors that want to participate, want to counsel their patients, we're going to, as a medical society, we're not going to oppose them doing it. And in fact, we may even provide information how they can understand the law and help their patients do so. So that was a big change. So we really feel like this year, with the 46 sponsors, with the medical society, there was a very big public hearing. Many people came out and spoke back in June. And then Maine, of course, some of our neighboring states in New England, Maine, New Jersey, that's not New England, but it's close enough. We just feel like there is a movement, there's a momentum that's growing in the country. Maryland almost passed it even before Maine and New Jersey. So there's that momentum. We feel like maybe it's time. Massachusetts could and should become state number 10 to allow this death with dignity concept and this law, this option for people to really, the bottom line is just to reduce suffering at the end. And I think I'm probably close to time, or do I have any more?
You have more time.
Oh my gosh, I'm usually way over time. But you know, we'll have dialogue, we'll have question and answer, and it's highly unusual for me to stop before my time is up, but I think I've kind of laid it out pretty well, both my own motivation, you know, what draws me to keep doing this. Maybe I'll just say, I do this voluntarily. I'm the director of this organization. I work kind of 20 or 30 hours at it. I take care of my grandchildren. I get together with friends. I do my retirement, you know, and I enjoy it. But I feel passionately, I feel strong about this. We have a very low budget. We don't have an office. I just work out of my home. I do it voluntarily. There's another organization with a paid staff around Boston, and we just collaborate. We work together. So there is a campaign throughout the state. Of course, I will say at the end, anybody who would like to be more involved, to get more information, to know just when the time is right, to contact your legislators or any legislator who's going to have an important say. If you'd like to add your name, we have an email action alert list, and that's out on the table out there. Or you can come up to me afterwards and talk. We'll be glad to add you. We have about 800 people now in this community of Western Mass, but also growing around the state. So we're hoping this will be the year, or early 2020, when we can become state number 10 to offer medical aid in dying, or you might even call it compassionate aid in dying. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Next up to speak is Sara Lee Bartley.
Thank you for being here. This is something that is very, very important to me. I'm going to give you a little background. 10 years ago, maybe a little more, my husband developed kidney disease. I had known he had had this from the time before we were married. But being 22, well, that was all going to be fixed by the time there was any problem. There would be, and it was to a certain degree. He had what is called Berkowitz disease. Two of our children, also have this kidney disease. And I have just learned that I too have failing kidneys because of diabetes. As far as how I want to die, I've made it very plain to my doctor. There should be no resuscitation. DNR is right on my refrigerator. I want to be able to die here in my nest at Treehouse with my family, hopefully. My husband suffered a great deal. He had a kidney transplant on our 45th wedding anniversary, which was pretty wonderful, but it didn't last. And he kept having problems like cardiac arrest, a brain hemorrhage, just one thing after another. And he had been in the hospital a lot of the time at Dartmouth-Hitchcock in New Hampshire, where we lived. And at times he would say to me, I don't think I want to keep doing this. And we would, as a family, say, well, when the time comes, we will be behind you. But then he would get the Energizer Bunny going. He always had a plan that he was going to make it. He did everything he could to try to stay with us. It was awful to watch him suffer. And I hope my kids don't have to go through that with me. I don't want that for them or for me. Life is precious. I'm going to be 81 in December, and I will not go on dialysis at age 80 or 81. My husband was in his 60s when it happened and had dialysis and the transplant. It was very, very hard to watch him die by inches, in pain, all the time. His legs had ulcerated. It's hard to talk about. I want people in this state not to have to go to Maine or wherever else. It's legal. When my husband finally decided that he had had enough, we actually had celebrated Thanksgiving at our oldest son's home. And he hadn't been eating at all. He just couldn't eat. In fact, one time I gave him bananas Foster for breakfast just to have him eat something, and he did eat that. Well, he ate everything in sight at that Thanksgiving dinner, and as we were driving home, it was a Thursday, and I said, well, we've got dialysis tomorrow. I don't know if I want to go, he said. Well, I said, we'll think about it. We'll talk about it in the morning. He had set times that he would go down to Conn Street to the Fresenius Dialysis Center. And the morning came, and he said, I'm too sick. And he was vomiting. And he was miserable. Because every time he had dialysis, it was supposed to make him feel better. Well, he felt awful going in for it. He would spend 3, sometimes 4 hours being dialyzed. Am I saying that right? And he would feel awful afterwards. Headache, tired, no energy, and no joy. There was just no joy. Even though the grandkids would come, people would come to try to cheer him up. And it was just very, very sad, because this man was an incredible guy. That's all he was one of the good guys. He started a business when we had 3 kids under the age of 5. There were weeks when we didn't get paid, but we kept on doing it. And he was a hard worker, and he was a good-hearted guy. This is hard for me to get through. I apologize. Finally, he just decided he could not do dialysis anymore. And so what he did really was against the law, as some people would say. But we didn't take anything or do anything extraordinary. He just stopped dialysis. That took 8 painful, horrible days. Every night he would come in and talk to me, and we'd talk in bed, and then he'd say, honey, would you come out and sit with me, please? Keep me company. Because he didn't want to be left alone, to die alone. We called in hospice, and they were wonderful the last 3 days, keeping him comfortable, more comfortable. I don't want that for anyone else who's suffering to have to go through something like that. I don't want to go through it if and when my time comes with this kidney issue. So please contact whoever you can to tell them to try to get this law passed. It's very, very important to a lot of people. And I think I'm through early, but I'm done.
Thank you, Sara.
Thank you.
Now, our next speaker is Dr. Shelly Berkowitz.
Well, first of all, thank you, Ed and John and Sara, for letting me share in this forum and in your personal stories. First, I have a disclosure to make about my own involvement with and support. I have to speak closer, I'm being warned.
You do.
And support of the End of Life Options Act. As a physician, I've worked in many different settings. While I'm currently working at the VA in Leeds as a medical consultant, my personal views are in no way meant to reflect or represent the views of the VA, but my views are the result of my personal journey as a human being, as a family member, and as a physician who has worked in many different settings over my thus far 35-year career. I had to say that or I'd get in trouble at the VA, but it's true. Back to my childhood. Oh, you'll be my helper. Thank you. I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish family in Brooklyn. You may hear the accent still. And to make the connection as to why this date is so emotionally loaded for me. I realize that maybe my view and my advocacy on the issue of self-determination and choice in the end of life was my way of atoning for the pain and the persistent residual personal guilt. That's the best way I can describe it, that I have felt for not being able to successfully advocate for my own parents' wishes in the ends of their life journeys. And despite my direct knowledge and my first-hand understanding and observations of my parents and what they told me, and knowing for certain what they wanted, my very religious sisters, Orthodox sisters, had their own personal views and beliefs, and their unwillingness to accept my parents' wishes over their own caused a very powerful clash and disagreement, which did not result then, or allow the result of either of my parents to have the peaceful, painless death that they wanted and that could have been achieved without my sister's various interventions. So to backtrack a little bit, I am the first generation and the youngest daughter of two parents who both survived the Holocaust. My parents were both interned in Auschwitz and in numerous other concentration camps before they ultimately obviously survived and came to the United States, where I was born. My oldest sister was born in Sweden, and my next sister was born here. My mother wrote 2 books about her war experiences, wartime experiences, and this was a constant topic of discussion in my home growing up. This made me exquisitely sensitive to and aware of the ethical issues that can lead to the loss of human dignity, both in life and in death. Specifically, my worst free-associated fears growing up led me to think of the Nazi euthanasia program, where those who were deemed unworthy of living were murdered under the euphemism of a, quote, mercy death. So with these pleasant images inscribed in my childhood memories, I was squeamish at first when I thought about how it would feel if I, as a physician, would be asked by a patient to participate in some way in helping them end their lives for themselves. My perpetual awareness and concern for the erosion of dignity in human life and the slippery slope, quote unquote, that could happen without ironclad safeguards caused my initial fear of supporting this bill. That's where I started out with, in the beginning. So let me continue the journey. I'll tell you more about my parents. My father, in 2007, at the ripe age of then 97 years old, was diagnosed with stomach cancer. And having made a promise to my parents that they could both remain and die at home, both myself and my 2 Orthodox sisters were initially in agreement with plans that would keep each of them comfortable, make rational medical decisions to be consistent with their goal, with this goal. Now, as a physician, I had more than one hat on in this situation. I was a family member, I was a physician, I knew some things my sisters didn't necessarily knew, but I had to be careful how to tread that line. I made sure that my sisters understood that while it would not be certain how my father's disease would progress, the important goal would be to avoid him dying a painful death from stomach obstruction due to the tumor growing. And that likely, before it reached that point, he would probably not feel like eating, and that it would be a much more painless death from dehydration and stopping eating naturally and allow nature to take its course. Now, my parents live in Brooklyn, and one day I was visiting. And as I was feeding my father, he was in a bed, a hospital bed, next to my mother, who was in a separate bed. I was feeding him with a spoon, and I spoke to him. He spoke Yiddish. And slowly he looked at me, he opened his eyes. I was about to put another spoon of something in there, and he was very alert, and he said to me, 9, which in Yiddish or German means no. He said 9, and he pushed the spoon away, and like that. And he closed his eyes, and he appeared to be very comfortably resting, and I felt that this is probably where it would end, and I was feeling relief thinking ahead. But my conscience made me feel I should call my sisters to make them aware of this development. You know, I called and I said, Dad has stopped eating, he's closed his eyes, maybe you want to visit. I had no idea how long this would take or where we're headed, but I thought they should know this. Well, what happened is one of my sisters then immediately called a private Jewish ambulance service called Hatzalah. That does very good work in other situations, but they convinced them to come to the house where they inserted a very large bore needle, an IV, into my father's arm, a very large one that normally you only do in a hospital setting. I don't know how they accomplished this, whether they had donated a lot of money to this cause, but I was horrified and watching this. And yes, I was there overnight with my sister. We were taking turns watching that the IV drip, drip, drip didn't run out hanging from a coat hanger from the ceiling. And I was in this medicalized role that I didn't want to be in, that I thought was wrong to begin with. Well, he did survive for a few more months. And unfortunately, my worst fears happened. He died an agonizing death from the pain of obstruction from this cancer growing. And that was my worst fear. Now, my sisters knew this, and I was not present when he died. I was in Massachusetts. They didn't call me to tell me his death was imminent. And I realized afterwards it's because he was in horrible pain, and they didn't want me to see or know, in a sense, that I was right, or to see this happen. Now, go ahead. From there, my mother, she was present in the room right next to my father, and she witnessed my father's death. And to backtrack with my mother now, 10 years or so before my father died, in 1998, she had a brain bleed. It was in a car accident in the Catskills. Somebody was driving, probably an ancient driver, and ironically, her fear of confinement from the fear of the gas chambers in Auschwitz always made her afraid of wearing a seatbelt. So she wouldn't wear a seatbelt, and everyone in that car walked away with nothing, but she was the only one. The car rolled into a ditch. She bled into her brain, broke her hip, was in a coma for a while. But she actually improved enough from this brain bleed to come back mentally to be my father's caretaker at home. He was 15 years older than she was, and already frail by the time she had her accident. Now, her near brush with death led her to tell me voluntarily, with my daughter present one time when we were visiting, she told me, and she wrote down specifically what she wanted and what she did not want at the end of her own life. She wrote that she didn't want anything heroic or unnatural. She wrote that she was of sound mind, which she was. She wrote these details on paper. She signed, she dated it. We took the original and hung it up, framed on top over her bed, and I kept the copy. Now, fast forward from there. My mother then developed progressive dementia after that. And she was very lovingly cared for in her own home, but she gradually, you can see where this is going, gradually needed to be hand-fed and require total care at home. It reached a point where she then couldn't remember how to swallow. She began choking and not being able to swallow food for herself. And I, again, at that point, felt another conversation would be useful. I reminded my sisters, look what's on the wall, what she doesn't want. They were talking about a feeding tube for her. And I was trying to remind them to not hurt her or to do anything against her wishes. This time, at least, my sisters agreed to not put a feeding tube in, but they kept persisting in aggressively feeding her despite repeated choking events, aspiration, which resulted in coughing and shortness of breath and discomfort. She would close her mouth to avoid the spoon, shake her leg. She was not completely nonverbal and non-responsive otherwise. When I last saw her in Brooklyn, 8 days before she died, which is coming up a year ago, Veterans Day. She died on Veterans Day last year. And her death came as a tremendous relief to me that at least her wishes were not as significantly ignored as my father's wishes were. So forward to the present now. While neither of my parents' specific medical circumstances would have fit into any appropriate consideration to seek physician-prescribed medications to end their lives, the way the current Death with Dignity Act is proposed, their pain and their suffering heightened my awareness of the need for, first of all, more education of family members to help them to accept both the inevitability of death, and also gave me more comfort in considering other options and views at the end of life to treat pain and suffering, both physical and emotional, and to preserve individual choice and dignity. Now, while, as you mentioned, hospice and palliative care are very helpful, they often are not enough alone. And from this perspective, I started learning more about the specific details that the Death with Dignity Act spelled out, both in the first state to adopt this, in Oregon in 1997, and the wording of the Massachusetts End of Life Options Act. Now, I'm a current delegate to the Massachusetts Medical Society, and I was really pleased when that body, as you said, 2017, changed their initial view from not supporting the bill to being, quote, engaged neutrality. And that this bill is now being, moving forward to be voted upon in Massachusetts in the legislature, finally. Now, the specific facts that I considered and that now make me completely comfortable supporting this and advocating for the passage of this bill is that, well, first of all, during the 22 years since this law has been in effect in Oregon, and now nine states total in DC, there has not been any case of abuse of the requirements of the law, despite scrutiny ongoing by the departments of health in these states, not affecting somebody's disability or their income status or any coercion, anything. Secondly, the screening by mental health professionals of each potential patient to be sure that they're not suffering from undiagnosed depression or mental illness, or feeling that they're doing this because they feel that they're a burden to their family, but rather that they're making a free choice decision based on their desire to preserve their autonomy and dignity in the end of life. Thirdly, this bill is much more restricted than would have applied to a longer-term illness. The current bill calls for, as you said, a terminal illness with an expected life expectancy of 6 months or less. In other words, qualify for hospice. And this offers more safeguards against any well-meaning, understandable, but maybe distorted concerns of the disability community and their families. And it completely eliminates my initial emotionally based and visceral resistance to my childhood family lore. Now, finally, the bill requires that prescribed lethal medication has to be self-administered by a patient of their own free will. And further, that no physician is required to write prescriptions if they don't feel completely comfortable doing so, either in general or with a specific patient. They can follow their conscience. Because of all of these, everything above, and the ongoing scrutiny by public health departments, and the actual small numbers of patients who have actually chosen this method and actually ended their lives this way. I strongly hope that you'll support the passage of this bill in Massachusetts, as do I, and thank you for the opportunity to listen to this.
Thank you, Shelly. Do you have any questions that you'd like to ask? We can, you can either write it down, or perhaps we could bring a microphone over to you.
I just wanted to know how the hospitals and medical facilities feel about this act, because it definitely goes against what they're supposed to do in regards to taking care of people, but also it's a business, and they want that money, you know? So it's their job to keep you alive when you want to end it, and they're just trying to prolong your life.
Go on, John.
Whoever would like to answer?
Well, I think I can say a few things about that. I certainly don't represent every doctor, in this country or in this community. But I've had many dialogues, both individually and parts of other forums, medical staff meetings, etc. And actually, what I've personally experienced and seen is that people are very receptive to this being passed. This may just be this community that I'm in. And the actual physician who now has recently been hired as a palliative care physician was very much mentioning this with a sense of welcome, that there would be another option, that this is another option. I don't think there's any adversarial role of patients versus hospitals in this regard.
I worked in a nursing home back in the day, and I remember seeing the DNR taped above the headboard at, where the patients were. I have one on my refrigerator, and I am having, Ed actually is going to shrink it down for me, so I'm going to carry it in my wallet with my file of life that I have.
First of all, we all know that the healthcare system is wonderful and can be not wonderful, whether it's in the hospital or individual physicians. It's challenging. There's kind of a healthcare crisis. So in some ways, even if you can no longer make your healthcare decisions yourself, you have a healthcare proxy. You have somebody who really wants to go to bat for you. Sounds like in your friend's case or your relative's case. But some hospitals are going to listen to, respect a patient's wishes for do not resuscitate, or don't intubate, or don't ventilate, some of those aggressive things that happen at the end to keep people alive, which is a good goal in and of itself. But what about the quality while you're alive after those things? And that's what I think people lose. And quite often it can be a worse quality of life, but you're still alive for another month or week or more. But I just wanted to also give you a picture of what this movement is about. Two doctors, besides Dr. Berkowitz down here, I just want to mention. One is David Clive. He has taught medicine at UMass Medical School in Worcester. We've been doing outreach in Worcester, so I was on a panel with him twice, just like this. He's a real supporter. And I left out, not only has he taught at UMass Medical School for, and especially end-of-life care, and all those issues, he also is a hospice physician, one of 2 or 3, at the biggest residential, I think that's true, facility in the state. It's in Newton. It's called Good Shepherd Community Care. Have you heard of that? No? Well, it's big if it's not the biggest. It's near Boston, many beds. And so he is at the deathbed. He is at the end of life quite often. So he feels very strongly about many patients want this kind of option, sort of like Dr. Berkowitz's parents spoke of, but they, because of their conditions, it just didn't work that way. But all these stories, or Sara Lee's story, all the stories. So David Clive, he just wrote a letter to the editor of the Worcester paper, Telegram, in response. There are opponents. There are opponents in the medical society. Some physicians oppose this, whether they're in the hospital or they're just practitioners in private practice. So one of the opponents, he spoke also. Everyone gets a chance to speak for 3 minutes at the public hearing, which was in front of the State House, 500 people in a room. And that opponent was named Dr. Mark Rollo. And then in September, he had a big article in the Telegram, and even though he says, I want to do no harm, that's what I took the oath of being a doctor, but what he leaves out is it doing more harm to keep people alive, especially when it's against their wishes? And that's sort of part of the crux. But the fact is the medical community has changed, as Dr. Berkowitz and John Berkowitz both have, said. It has changed, not just in this state, but in many states around the country. I won't say all. It's changed. And they want people to have the option of, if you want to avoid a very difficult ending because of your terminal illness, you could choose to end your life on your own terms with a quality you take this medication, you mix it in a cup of water, you take it yourself. You can be alone if you want, or you can have your loved ones or hospice people or your doctor, whoever wants to be your witness or be present with you. People are different. Some want to be alone, whether it's to meet their maker, the God, if they're religious, or just to be alone because they're moving on after a wonderful life, or maybe a difficult life, but, end of life. I think I'm going on longer than I meant to, but that doctor, versus the opponent doctor, yeah, there are opponents, but I do believe they are in the minority, even though they can seem very vocal. But we just keep educating, we informing, we keep putting out our statements and our arguments, and that would be one example. And I'll leave out the other example for maybe another question or later and open it up to more comments.
I'd like to know who declares or certifies competence for the person, the patient, and if the doctor doesn't agree, does it have to be another medical person? Does it have to be a psychiatrist? And would there have to be more than one person to certify that this person is mentally capable of making that decision?
Yeah. That's tough. I'm not an expert. I'm not a psychiatrist, for one thing. And when you use the word competence, it's a legal term, actually, which doesn't seem like it should be different than saying, is this person with it enough to understand what they're asking for, which is really what it's about. But when there is any question, I would think, and John can tell me more, there would be a second person, there would be more than one person who is saying they are or they not able to understand this. I think it's two, right? Correct?
Actually, it's
Thank you.
3.
3. Okay.
Let me answer the really good question and add to what Dr. Berkowitz and Shelly they know about it. I mean, I'm living with this every day. They're just guests on the panel, and they think about it and care deeply. But that's why a lot of people don't realize Massachusetts added an additional safeguard. In other words, Oregon, 22 years, to be eligible to receive a prescription and choose the option of death with dignity, you have to see your own doctor and be diagnosed with a terminal illness, 6 months or less to live. Then you have to have a waiting period of 2 weeks and go see another doctor, a consulting doctor, another MD, who will verify and confirm the first doctor's diagnosis. So that's built in partly because, sometimes there's misdiagnosis, so let's have a quality control here. Let's have 2 doctors. And the 2 weeks apart is a safeguard so that a person might be under psychological duress, might not be, to have a think it over period, so it's not impulsive. I went to my doctor, I'm terminally ill, I'm going to end my life as soon as let's think about this. Let's talk with family. Let's talk with religious leaders if that's in somebody's life. So that's two doctors who not only attest that you are terminally ill, but doctors are also supposed to be able to detect clinical depression. And by the way, when you get a terminal, correct me if I'm wrong, but quite often you might have a 10 or 15 minute appointment, for a normal checkup or things like that. But if you're getting a terminal diagnosis from your doctor, whether you've had her or him for 3 years or 30, you're going to have a much longer appointment. That's that's a very serious diagnosis and a serious message. So that doctor is also going to get a feeling for, are you asking for death with dignity? Are you asking to be eligible, qualify for this bill and this law if it's passed? Are you in your right mind? Are you under duress? Are family members or lawyers or somewhere else in your life, coercing you? Are you really understanding that you're asking to end your life by your own hand, by your own self? Do you understand the full ramifications? So that's two different doctors looking at that. That has been enough in all the other states that have passed these laws to avoid any situation where there's been no court case where somebody said those two doctors missed depression or missed, they both misdiagnosed. There just hasn't been any litigation, no proof, no allegations have been substantiated. So, but Massachusetts decided, let's add another level here. Let's add an extra precaution. Let's add a qualified mental health professional who does not have to be a psychiatrist, but does have to be a licensed mental health professional, a psychologist, a licensed social worker. What are the other acronyms? I can't think of them right off. But that's a third meeting to add to the two doctors. And that qualified mental health professional has to meet with, let's say it was myself asking to be qualified for this law. And that person has to report back to the first doctor, your own doctor, and say, I met with this patient and they are clearly mentally capable. They understand their decisions. They're able to make their own. They shouldn't have their healthcare proxy making their decisions for them. They are their own guardian, their own healthcare decision maker. So that's an extra safeguard that's built into our bill. Hawaii actually also added that, I should say, that one other state, and they just did that in November a year ago. Maine and New Jersey that passed the laws and got they do not have that step, if I understand it right. So we just decided to add it, to strengthen it, to add another, call it another obstacle, and it is in some ways. You're terminally ill. You have 6 months to live, perhaps, maybe less. It can happen that way. There's three different. Some people feel like this is too much, and they resent that I have to go to a third meeting, but we haven't passed the law yet, and we just felt, me, Representative Kafka, the other legislative leaders, and other citizen advocates, it's like, all right, to get this passed, let's add one more step, one more safeguard. And I hope that's answered your question and made it as concrete as possible.
I understand this is still in committee and hasn't been brought before the full legislature yet to vote. Is this correct?
That is correct. The Public Health Committee, obviously it's a health care option, a health care issue. That's where it always gets referred to, and that's where it's always died in the past, never gotten out of the Health Care Committee. By the way, there are many committees in the legislature, transportation, everything. 17 members of the committee, some senators, mostly representatives. It's a joint, both houses. And that's where it is this year. It was introduced in January, went into the committee. They held the public hearing. They held it much earlier than other years. That's another encouraging sign. And I think they held it earlier. Remember I said it happened in June, 500 people in the room. I would say 300 of those were supporters, like myself and others, and 200 were opponents. They turned out, like that doctor I mentioned, Dr. Mark Rollo and others. So the hearing was held on June 25th, but they have not deliberated on the testimony. They haven't sat down as a committee and either said, we're in favor of this legislation, we think the full House should vote on this. We'll pass it. They call it voting it out in favor or something like that. That would pass it and enable, hopefully, the full House to debate this bill. And that is our goal, to get it passed by the committee. And they recess on November 22nd, before Thanksgiving, and they don't come back until January 3rd. So the goal of the whole campaign is, thank your legislator. By the way, let's make it really specific. We are here in Easthampton. Thank Representative Daniel Carey. He's been a co-sponsor of the bill. And by the way, he's a very new legislator. He took over from a longtime legislator and a well-loved guy named John Syback. And he was a co-sponsor until he retired last November, wasn't it? A year ago. But current legislator is a co-sponsor, a supporter. That's great. You can thank him. By the way, he's not on the committee, but he would like to have the chance to vote for this if it was passed by the committee. So that's the urgency, and that's what anybody who's watching this show, whether they're in this community or if this program gets put on in any other community around the state, to contact your legislator. But I will say, especially, at least in the next month and a half, contact the head, the chairman, co-chairman of the Public Health Committee. He's a Worcester representative named John Mahoney. He's the co-chair. The other co-chair is our state senator. I should bring her into the conversation, from Hampshire, Franklin, and a little bit of Hampden counties. That's Joanne Comerford. She's a co-sponsor. She's a strong supporter. We don't have to convince her. John Mahoney, I think, is very supportive of this, but he was not a co-sponsor. So we're just sort of saying, contact Mahoney, say thank you, that was a great public hearing. You didn't have to be there, you just heard about it from me. It was a good public hearing. It went for 7 hours, and they had 70 people, testify one after the other, very emotionally. But now, please, take that testimony, deliberate, and hopefully pass it, just like these other states around us are passing it, and give our legislature the chance to debate it themselves, and then hopefully pass it, and we become state number 10. Tito, can I just stop you for a minute? And I called this man by his first name, but I'm going to say it's Dr. Tito Gambarini. And because you're speaking softly, many people are not able to hear, including who's going to listen to this program. So if I could just echo back what you're saying, and then you can continue. Dr. Gambarini lives here in Easthampton. He's a retired surgeon, retired for about 30 years or more. Yes, and yes, and I also want to add, he attended the public hearing at the age of 96. Now you're 97. You just said that, and you spoke. You stood up and spoke at that public hearing briefly. So now, please carry on with what you're saying. Let me summarize what you just said, and then maybe we also move on if there's some other comments or questions. Dr. Gambarini just said that at age 97, you have beaten cancer diagnoses, serious cancer diagnoses, several times in your last 30 years. And you said you just got diagnosed again with a new cancer? Yes. And you also said your wife died 7 years ago, and that was a difficult experience. You are ready to go, and you also just said you want this law to be passed because you believe yourself and anyone else should have the option of a more peaceful, painless death.
Is there anyone else who would like to add any further comment from the forum members? Thank you very much, Dr. Shelly Berkowitz, Sara Lee Bartley, and John Berkowitz for being here this evening. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you.